January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the rain-soaked hills of northern Luzon, Philippines. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It drummed against the canvas tents with a persistence that seemed almost vindictive, turning the red volcanic soil into rivers of rust-colored mud. Inside a makeshift processing camp designated Compound 7, 32 Japanese women sat in silence on wooden benches, their backs straight despite exhaustion, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. They were nurses, comfort station workers, civilian administrators, women who had followed the Imperial Japanese Army into the occupied territories and now found themselves prisoners of an enemy they had been taught to fear more than death itself. The youngest among them was 19, the oldest 43. They wore whatever clothing had survived the chaos of capture, torn monpe trousers, stained white blouses, rubber-soled tabi boots caked with mud. Their hair, once carefully maintained according to military regulation, now hung in damp tangles. Some still clutched small bundles, a spare undergarment, a photograph, a comb. These were all that remained of lives that had ended 3 days earlier when American forces overran Field Hospital No. 12. They waited for what they knew must come. The stories had been clear. The instructional pamphlets distributed by the Kempeitai, the military police, had been explicit. American soldiers were beasts, demons in human form. They would torture, they would violate, they would degrade. Death, they had been told, was preferable to capture. Several nurses at the field hospital had chosen that path, swallowing cyanide capsules or clutching live grenade to their chests as the Americans approached. These 32 had not. Whether from cowardice or curiosity or simple exhaustion, they had survived, and now they sat in the rain-drummed silence, waiting for horror to begin. What they could not have known, what no propaganda leaflet or ideological briefing could have prepared them for, was that the horror would not come. Instead, something far more destabilizing would arrive, a question about rice. To understand the shock that would ripple through Compound 7 in the weeks that followed, one must first understand the ideological architecture that shaped these women's understanding of the world. They had come of age in an empire that defined itself through rigid hierarchies, absolute obedience, and the subordination of individual will to collective purpose. The concept of Yamata Damashi, the Japanese spirit, permeated every aspect of military and civilian life. It demanded self-sacrifice, stoic endurance, and unwavering loyalty to the emperor, who was not merely a political leader but a living deity whose rule was synonymous with cosmic order. For women in Imperial Japan, this ideology carried specific expectations. They were to embody Raya Saikenbo, good wives and wise mothers, existing primarily as instruments of national reproduction and spiritual fortification. Even those who served in military capacities as nurses or administrators did so within strictly defined boundaries. Their labor was valuable only insofar as it supported men's war efforts. Their thoughts, preferences, and desires were irrelevant luxuries in a nation mobilized for total war. The propaganda they had absorbed painted America as the antithesis of everything sacred. Americans were portrayed as materialistic degenerates, a mongrel race polluted by individualism and lacking spiritual depth. They lived for pleasure, for personal comfort, for the gratification of base desires. They had no concept of honor, no understanding of sacrifice. Their soldiers, the propaganda insisted, were cowards who relied on superior weapons rather than superior spirit. And their treatment of prisoners would reflect their barbarism, savage, unpredictable, inhuman. These women had believed these things absolutely, the way one believes in gravity or the rising sun. They had no framework for questioning them. And so, when American military police escorted them into Compound 7 and left them sitting in the rain, they interpreted the absence of immediate violence not as mercy but as a calm before inevitable atrocity. The question came on the 4th day. A U.S. Army lieutenant named Margaret Walsh entered the compound accompanied by a Nisei translator, a second-generation Japanese-American soldier named Thomas Nakamura. Walsh was 28, a dietitian from Wisconsin who had enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps in 1943 and been assigned to prison logistics in the Pacific Theater 6 months earlier. She carried a clipboard and wore the practical, mud-splattered uniform of someone who had long since abandoned any pretense of military glamour. Through Nakamura, she asked the women a simple question: "What would you like to eat?" The silence that followed was not merely confusion. It was ontological vertigo, the sensation of reality tilting sideways. Several women looked at each other, searching for confirmation that they had heard correctly. One of the older nurses, a woman named Fumiko Tanaka who had served in Manchuria before her posting to the Philippines, finally spoke. "We will eat whatever we are given." Walsh glanced at Nakamura, who translated. She frowned slightly, made a note on her clipboard, and tried again. "I understand, but we're asking what you would prefer. What foods are you accustomed to? What would make you comfortable?" Comfortable. The word hung in the damp air like something from a foreign language they had studied but never truly understood. Comfort was not a category that existed in their experience of military life. One endured, one persevered, one accepted what was provided and did not question. The idea that an enemy captor would concern himself with their comfort was so alien it seemed almost threatening. A trick, surely, designed to lower their guard before the real punishment began. Fumiko Tanaka, who had been designated by unspoken consensus as a group spokesperson, tried again. "We require only rice and miso. We will cause no trouble." Walsh smiled, not unkindly, but with a hint of exasperation. "I'm not worried about trouble. I'm trying to set up a proper diet plan. You will be here for a while. We need to make sure you're adequately nourished. So I'm asking, what would you normally eat? What do you need?" The question was repeated, clarified, rephrased. Eventually, haltingly, the women provided a list: rice, miso paste, dried fish, pickled vegetables, soy sauce, seaweed. Basic staples of Japanese diet, nothing extravagant. Walsh wrote everything down, thanked them through Nakamura, and left. The women sat in bewildered silence after she departed. Several were convinced it had been a test of some kind, though none could articulate what kind of test or what the correct answer might have been. They would be given rice, perhaps, but it would be spoiled or insufficient. Or they would be punished for requesting anything at all. Or the food would arrive drugged. These theories circulated in whispers as the afternoon rain began again. What arrived instead, 2 days later, was more disorienting than any punishment could have been. The crates were delivered by 2 African-American soldiers from the 93rd Infantry Division. They set them down carefully in the covered area that had been designated as the camp's communal kitchen, a space with a roof of corrugated metal, 3 makeshift tables, and a pair of large cooking pots. The soldiers smiled, said something in English the women didn't understand, and left. Inside the crates, 50 pounds of California-grown short-grain rice, 6 large containers of miso paste, dried bonito flakes, kombu seaweed, soy sauce in glass bottles with labels in English and Japanese, pickled daikon radish, dried shiitake mushrooms, noi sheets, a small container of sake for cooking, and, inexplicably, a bag of American white sugar. Fumiko Tanaka stood over the open crates for a long moment, her weathered hand hovering over the contents as though afraid they might vanish if touched. Other women gathered around, equally silent. Someone began to cry softly. Another woman reached out and touched the rice with trembling fingers, letting the grains run through her palm like sand. This was not survival rations. This was not the bare minimum required to keep prisoners alive for interrogation. This was food, real food, the kind they had not seen in months, even before their capture. The kind that had become increasingly scarce as American submarines strangled Japan's supply lines and the Empire's logistics collapsed under the weight of a war it was losing. And then Lieutenant Walsh returned, accompanied again by Nakamura, and delivered the second shock. "You will prepare your own meals," she said. "We'll provide the ingredients and the fuel for cooking. You organize the preparation however you see fit. There's a duty roster system if you want to set up rotating teams, or you can do communal cooking, whatever works for you. The only requirement is that you maintain basic sanitation standards, which Corporal Nakamura will explain." She paused, consulting her clipboard. "We'll inspect the facilities once a week to make sure everything's clean, but otherwise, this is your space. You're in charge of it." The translation hung in the air. You're in charge. You organize it. You decide. These were not phrases that existed in the women's military vocabulary. In the Imperial Japanese Army, every aspect of daily life was regulated, prescribed, controlled. Meals came at designated times, prepared by designated personnel, in designated quantities. Deviation was not merely discouraged, it was conceptually impossible. The machinery of military hierarchy left no room for individual preference or autonomous decision-making. And yet here, in an enemy prisoner camp, they were being told to govern themselves, to make choices, to exercise preference. One of the younger women, a nurse named Keiko Yamamoto who had barely spoken since her capture, finally found her voice. "Why?" she asked in Japanese, looking directly at Nakamura. "Why are they doing this?" Nakamura hesitated before translating. Walsh's answer, when it came, was almost offhand. "Because you're human beings," she said, "and human beings should be allowed to cook their own food." The first meal they prepared took 6 hours, not because the cooking itself was complicated, but because the women moved through each step as though navigating a minefield. They debated every decision in hushed, anxious conferences. Who would cook? Should they elect someone or volunteer? What if the Americans were testing them to see who took leadership? Would that person be singled out for punishment or interrogation? And what if the food was still a trap? What if they were meant to poison themselves through some contamination in the ingredients? Eventually, necessity overcame paralysis. Fumiko Tanaka, drawing on her experience as the oldest and most senior, took charge. She organized the women into work teams, some to wash the rice, some to prepare the miso soup, some to soak the dried fish and mushrooms. They worked in near silence, each woman hyper-aware of being watched, though when they glanced nervously toward the compound gate, they saw only the usual guards, who paid them no particular attention. The rice cooker, a large American pot that Fumiko eyed skeptically, was filled with water according to her practiced judgment, refined over decades. The rice was washed 3 times, the water cloudy and then gradually clear. Miso paste was dissolved in hot water, the dried bonito and kombu added to create dashi stock. Someone discovered that one of the women, a former comfort station cook named Haruko Soto, knew how to properly rehydrate dried shiitake mushrooms. They added them to the soup along with cubes of tofu that had been included in the supplies. The smell that began to rise from the cooking pots was so achingly familiar it bordered on painful. It smelled like home, or what home had been before the war consumed everything. It smelled like normalcy, like the world before empire and ideology and death. When the rice was finally ready and the soup had simmered to proper flavor, the women served themselves using provided bowls and chopsticks. They sat on benches at the long tables, 32 women holding 32 bowls, and for a long moment, nobody moved. Fumiko Tanaka lifted her bowl to her lips and sipped. The miso was slightly too salty. She had overcompensated, unused to the quality of the paste, but the fundamental taste was right. It was real miso soup, made by Japanese hands, flavored according to Japanese judgment. She set the bowl down and discovered she was crying. Around the table, others were crying too, some silently, tears running down hollow cheeks, others openly, shoulders shaking, not from sadness, exactly, though sadness was part of it. They cried from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of being treated like human beings by an enemy they had been taught to regard as demons. They cried from the sudden, destabilizing realization that everything they had been told might be wrong. They cried from the simple, animal relief of eating familiar food after months of near starvation on Imperial Army rations that had dwindled to rice gruel and pickled plums. One of the guards, a young private from Texas who was stationed near the kitchen area, watched them eat with an expression of mild puzzlement. He had no idea what he was witnessing. He could not have known that for these women, this simple meal represented the collapse of an entire worldview. Because if Americans allowed Japanese prisoners to cook their own food, if they provided quality ingredients and respected culinary autonomy, then what else might the propaganda have lied about? The transformation did not happen overnight. Ideology does not dissolve like sugar in water. It crumbles slowly, eroded by repeated exposure to contradictory evidence. But the evidence kept coming. Within a week, Lieutenant Walsh arranged for the women to receive fresh vegetables, tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, potatoes, American produce, grown in American soil, distributed without resentment or ceremony. The women learned to incorporate these foreign vegetables into familiar dishes, creating hybrid meals that reflected their transitional state: miso soup with potato, rice topped with stir-fried carrots, seaweed salad with lettuce. They were given cooking oil, salt, pepper. When one of the women mentioned during an inspection that they missed taquan, pickled radish. A jar appeared 3 days later, procured from God knows where by supply officers who probably had no idea what it was. The women began to organize their kitchen with increasing confidence. They established a rotation system, with teams of 4 women responsible for each day's cooking. They cleaned the space meticulously, not from fear of punishment but from ingrained habit and a growing sense of proprietary pride. This was their kitchen. They maintained it accordingly. Small freedoms accumulated. They were allowed to adjust the seasoning to their taste. They could choose whether to cook rice plain or add barley. They could decide the soup's thickness, the vegetables' proportions, the meal's timing. These were trivial decisions in absolute terms, the kind of mundane choices free people make without thought. But for women who had spent years in a system that permitted no choices at all, they carried revolutionary weight. And slowly, conversation began to flow during meals. Tentative at first, constrained to safe topics, techniques of making rice more flavorful, memories of dishes from home, debates about the proper ratio of miso to dashi. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Keiko Yamamoto, the young nurse, spoke one evening about her mother's kitchen in Osaka, about learning to make onigiri rice bowls as a child, about the smell of grilling fish that had filled their neighborhood before the war. Others shared similar memories, fragments of ordinary life before militarization consumed everything. Someone, nobody later remembered who, eventually voiced a question that had been circulating unspoken for weeks. Why are they feeding us this way? What do they want from us? The theories multiplied. Perhaps it was strategic kindness, designed to encourage defection or extract intelligence. Perhaps the Americans were so wealthy, so drowning in abundance, that even prisoners ate well. Perhaps this was a temporary situation, soon to be replaced by standard prison brutality once the immediate military situation stabilized. But as weeks became months, the consistency of treatment became harder to dismiss as aberration. The food continued to arrive. The autonomy continued. When one of the women fell ill with dysentery, she received medical care indistinguishable from what American soldiers received: sulfur drugs, rehydration therapy, rest in a clean bed. When another woman's birthday passed, the camp administration provided extra sugar and eggs so the others could bake something approximating a cake, a strange hybrid dessert that was neither Japanese nor American but belonged to the liminal space they now inhabited. The symbolic weight of rice, that most fundamental of Japanese staples, became impossible to ignore. Every day, they cooked rice provided by American abundance. Every day, they ate from American supplies that exceeded what the Imperial Japanese Army had been able to provide its own personnel in the war's final months. The propaganda had promised them that Japan's spiritual purity would overcome American material advantage. But hey, in the most intimate and undeniable way possible, material advantage was revealing itself as a foundation of dignity. In June 1945, Fumiko Tanaka requested a meeting with Lieutenant Walsh. Through Nakamura, she asked a question that had been troubling her. In Japan, she said carefully, prisoners are not treated this way. They exist to be punished, to reflect on their shame. But hey, we are cooking our own food. We are making choices. Why does America do this? Walsh considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because we believe that even prisoners retain their humanity, she said. Even people who are our enemies are still people. They still have dignity that should be respected, even in captivity. That's what we're fighting for, the idea that every person has inherent worth, not because of their rank or their nation or their obedience, but just because they are human. Nakamura translated. Fumiko listened with the intensity of someone hearing a foreign language for the first time and recognizing, with shock, that it made sense. This is democracy, she asked. Part of it, Walsh said. Democracy means a lot of things. But yes, this is part of it. The belief that people should have the freedom to make choices about their own lives. Even small choices, like what to eat or how to cook it. The conversation stayed with Fumiko for days afterward. She shared it with the others during evening meals, and it sparked debates that stretched late into the tropical nights. Some women remained skeptical. Surely this was exceptional treatment, not representative of American values broadly. Surely ordinary Americans did not live with such abundance or such freedom. But then letters began to arrive from home. The camp's postal system, established in accordance with Geneva Convention protocols, allowed the women to write to family members in Japan and, eventually, to receive responses. The letters that came back from the home islands painted a picture of devastating scarcity. Food rations had been cut again. Cities were being firebombed. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. The government spoke of glorious resistance and spiritual victory, but between the lines, the women could read desperation and collapse. Meanwhile, they sat in a prisoner camp eating rice and miso, vegetables and fish, cooked according to their own judgment with ingredient provided by an enemy that treated them better than their own government had. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for some. 2 of the women withdrew into silence, refusing to participate in communal cooking, eating only the bare minimum required for survival. They could not reconcile the reality of their treatment with the ideology that had structured their entire understanding of the world. The contradiction was too destabilizing. But most of the women began, slowly, to adjust their understanding, not through dramatic conversion or sudden enlightenment, but through the accumulated weight of small daily experiences. Each meal they prepared was an act of autonomous choice. Each instance of respectful treatment was a data point contradicting years of propaganda. Each conversation with American personnel revealed not demons but ordinary people, tired, homesick, sometimes kind, sometimes indifferent, but fundamentally recognizable as human. The rice became their daily reminder of this transformation. Every morning, they washed it and cooked it, measuring water by practiced eye, judging doneness by texture and steam. And every time they lifted a bowl of properly cooked rice to their lips, rice they had prepared themselves, from ingredients freely given, they participated in an act that undermined everything they had been taught about the enemy and about themselves. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's voice, transmitted by radio to the scattered remnants of his empire, announced surrender. In Compound 7, the women listened to the broadcast in stunned silence. Some wept, some sat motionless, faces blank with shock. The war was over. The empire had fallen. The divine nation, which was supposed to prevail through spiritual superiority, had been defeated by the materialistic Americans who nevertheless treated their prisoners with dignity. In the days that followed, as the reality of Japan's surrender penetrated their consciousness, the women gathered in the kitchen as they had every day for months. They washed rice. They prepared soup. They cooked with the ingredient provided by their captors, former captors now, technically, though their status remained unclear in the immediate post-war chaos. Lieutenant Walsh came to speak with them, Nakamura translating. "You will be repatriated," she said. "It'll take time, maybe weeks, maybe months, but you'll be going home. In the meantime, nothing changes here. You will continue to receive food and supplies. You will continue to manage your own cooking." One of the younger women raised her hand tentatively, as though she was still a schoolgirl. "When we go back to Japan," she asked, "what will we find?" Walsh's expression was grave. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I won't lie to you. Japan is devastated. There's widespread hunger, destruction, chaos. Rebuilding will take years. It will be very hard." She paused, then added, "But you will be free. Japan will have a new government, a democratic government. You will have rights, the right to vote, to own property, to make choices about your lives. Women will have those rights equally with men. That's what the occupation will establish." The translation of that final sentence, "women will have those rights equally with men," produced a ripple of incredulity. Several women exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with something that might have been hope. That evening, they cooked what they decided would be their last meal as prisoners of war, though in fact their repatriation would take another 6 weeks to arrange. They prepared red rice, sekihan, the traditional Japanese dish for celebrations, using precious azuki beans that Lieutenant Walsh somehow managed to procure. They made clear soup with tofu and wakame seaweed. They arranged pickled vegetables with the kind of care usually reserved for formal occasions. They ate together in the kitchen that had become their sanctuary, their classroom in democracy. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, and they talked about what awaited them: the destroyed cities, the uncertain future, the strange new world of freedom and choice that Americans promised would be built on the ruins of empire. Fumiko Tanaka, who had been the first to question why they were treated with dignity, who had gradually transformed from skeptic to believer, stood to address the group. When we go home, she said, we will tell people what we learned here. Not just that Americans gave us food, but that they gave us choices. They treated us as human beings even when we were enemies. They showed us that abundance and freedom are connected, that a nation wealthy enough to feed its prisoners as well as a nation that values human dignity. She gestured to the bowls of red rice before them. This rice, she said, is not just food. It is evidence. Evidence that what we were taught was wrong. Evidence that strength does not come only from sacrifice and obedience, but from respecting the humanity of every person. Evidence that there is another way to live. Several women nodded. Others remained silent, still processing the implications of everything they had experienced. But they all ate the rice. And in that act, in the simple, profound gesture of eating food they had chosen to prepare, seasoned to their taste, cooked by their hands with ingredients provided by an enemy that had proven more humane than their own government, they participated in a transformation that would ripple outward through their lives and, in small ways, through the society they would rejoin. The repatriation ships left Manila in early October. The women of Compound 7 boarded with their meager possessions, supplemented by Red Cross packages and letters of transit. Some carried recipe cards they had written during their captivity, recording hybrid dishes that blended Japanese technique with American ingredients. Small artifact of a liminal experience. The ships crossed the Pacific slowly, crowded with returning prisoners and displaced civilians. Food on board was basic, survival rations, nothing more. The women, accustomed now to better treatment, did not complain, but they noticed a decline. They noticed what it meant to be fed merely adequately rather than well. When they finally reached Japan, most disembarking at Yokohama or Sasebo, they found a country that bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. Cities were rubble fields. Infrastructure had collapsed. Hunger was endemic. The black market flourished while official rations dwindled to near starvation levels. American occupation forces distributed emergency food supplies to prevent mass famine. The women scattered to their home prefectures, to whatever remained of family and community. Some found their houses destroyed, their relatives dead or missing. Others discovered families that had survived but were struggling desperately in the post-war chaos. They slipped back into civilian life, or tried to, carrying memories of those months in Compound 7 like a secret knowledge. Fumiko Tanaka returned to her hometown in Kyoto, where her sister's family had survived the war intact but malnourished. She told them about her captivity, about cooking rice with ingredients provided by Americans, about being asked what she wanted to eat. Her sister listened with an expression of bewilderment. "They treated you better than our own army treated you," she said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," Fumiko said, "much better." In the years that followed, as Japan underwent its transformation under American occupation, the women who had lived through those months in Compound 7 carried their experience forward in quiet ways. They voted in the first post-war elections that granted women suffrage, an act of autonomous choice that echoed those earlier choices about how to season soup or cook rice. They participated in the democratic institutions that were being built on the ruins of empire. They taught their children and grandchildren that freedom and dignity were not weaknesses but strengths. Most of them never spoke publicly about their time as prisoners of war. The experience carried complicated shame, the shame of capture, of survival, of having been treated well by the enemy. But privately, in conversations with friends or family, some of them reflected on what they had learned. Keiko Yamamoto, the young nurse, would later write in a private journal that was discovered after her death in 1987. "We expected to be destroyed by Americans. Instead, they taught us to cook our own food. This seems like a small thing, but it was everything. It was the first time in my adult life that anyone asked me what I wanted, and then gave it to me. That simple act, being asked what I wanted, changed how I understood myself in the world. I learned that I could want things, that my preferences mattered, that I was a person with dignity even as a prisoner. This is what democracy meant, I think. Not just voting or government structures, but the daily practice of being treated as someone whose choices matter." There is a photograph taken in September 1945 by an Army Signal Corps photographer whose name has been lost to time. It shows the interior of Compound 7's kitchen, 3 women preparing rice, their faces concentrating on the familiar task, steam rising from the pot. The image is mundane, almost boring. It could be a kitchen anywhere, women engaged in the universal labor of feeding people. But encoded in that mundane image is profound disruption of ideology. These are enemy prisoners, nationals of defeated empire, women who were taught that capture was worse than death. And they are cooking their own food, exercising autonomous choice, participating in the daily democracy of deciding what and how to eat. The photograph was filed in military archives and forgotten. It never appeared in newspapers or magazines. It documented no dramatic battle, no historic surrender, no moment of obvious significance, just women cooking rice. But perhaps that is precisely what makes it significant, because the great transformations of history are not only decided on battlefields or in conference rooms. They happen in kitchens, in the daily practices that constitute ordinary life. They happen when people raised under totalitarianism encounter the mundane freedoms of democracy, the freedom to season soup to your taste, to choose what vegetables to include in a meal, to decide when and how to eat. Rice became the symbol of that transformation, not the rice itself, but what it represented: abundance rather than scarcity, choice rather than compulsion, dignity rather than degradation. Every bowl of rice that the women of Compound 7 prepared and ate was an argument against the ideology that had brought them to that moment. Every grain testified to the possibility of a different way of living. The war ended with surrender documents and military tribunals, with occupation policies and constitutional reforms. But for 32 Japanese women in a prisoner compound in the Philippines, the war ended in a kitchen, with a discovery that their enemies respected their humanity enough to let them cook their own meals. That discovery did not erase the trauma of war. It did not resolve the moral complexities of empire and occupation. It did not make suffering meaningful or justify the deaths of millions. But it did something simpler and perhaps more radical. It demonstrated that the values Americans claimed to fight for were not merely propaganda, not just empty rhetoric deployed to justify violence, but principles that could be enacted in daily practice, even toward enemies, even in the midst of war. The women learned that abundance and dignity were connected, that material prosperity and human rights reinforce each other, that society wealthy enough to feed its prisoners well was a society that took human worth seriously. They learned that democracy was not just a political system but a practice of respect, enacted in 10,000 small decisions about how to treat other people. And they learned it through rice, through the simple, profound act of being allowed to prepare their own food, to exercise choice in the most basic domain of human existence, to maintain their cultural identity and personal agency even in captivity. When they returned to Japan and found their nation transformed, occupied, reformed, and rebuilt along democratic lines, they carried this knowledge with them. They had already lived through democracy's most basic promise, that every person possesses inherent dignity regardless of circumstance. They had tasted it, literally, in every bowl of rice they cooked and ate in Compound 7. And in the decades that followed, as Japan remade itself into a prosperous democracy, as women gained rights they had never possessed under empire, as a nation transformed from militaristic autocracy to peaceful prosperity, perhaps those lessons echoed forward in ways too subtle to measure but too significant to dismiss. Because transformation begins not with grand declarations but with simple questions. What would you like to eat? How do you want to prepare it? What do you need to feel human? The women of Compound 7 learned that their enemies knew to ask those questions, and more importantly, knew to respect the answers. They learned that freedom could be practiced in a kitchen, that democracy could be tasted in rice, that human dignity could be preserved even in the midst of war's devastation. These lessons, learned through the mundane miracle of being allowed to cook their own meals, remain with them for the rest of their lives, quiet testimony to the transformative power of treating people, even enemies, as human beings worthy of choice, dignity, and respect. The rice they cooked in captivity became the rice they would later cook in freedom, and the difference between those two kinds of rice, the difference between compulsion and choice, between scarcity and abundance, between degradation and dignity, was a difference between empire and democracy, between the world that had been and the world that was becoming. In the end, the greatest shock these Japanese women experienced was not cruelty but kindness, not degradation but respect, not the confirmation of propaganda but its complete reversal. They were shocked by being treated as human beings. They were shocked by being asked what they wanted. They were shocked by abundance in the midst of war. And that shock, rippling outward through the rest of their lives, became its own quiet form of testimony, evidence that even in humanity's darkest moments, it remains possible to choose dignity over cruelty, generosity over brutality, and the simple democratic practice of asking people what they want and then giving it to them. The rice still steams in memory, in that kitchen in Compound 7. It steams with all the weight of transformation, with a burden of lessons learned too late and at terrible cost, with a fragile hope that human beings, given the chance, will choose to treat each other as human. It steams as evidence that freedom is not merely an abstraction but a daily practice, enacted in kitchens and conversations, in choices often respected, in the ordinary miracle of people making decisions about their own lives. And somewhere in that steam rises a truth that these 32 women discovered in captivity and carried back to their devastated homeland, that dignity cannot be destroyed by defeat, that humanity persists through catastrophe, and that the simple act of cooking one's own food can contain within it the seed of an entirely new world.